pain that changes people slowly, not overnight, not dramatically, quietly, invisibly. It hides behind smiles, normal conversations, and I'm fine responses that nobody questions deeply enough. And the strange part is, the people who suffer this pain the most are often the same people everyone describes as kind, understanding, emotionally strong, and impossible to hate. Empaths, people who absorb emotions deeply, people who notice energy shifts no one else sees, people who care so intensely that they sometimes carry emotional burdens that were never theirs to begin with. But something terrifying happens when an empath gets hurt repeatedly. At first, they try harder. Then they blame themselves. Then they become quieter. And eventually, something inside them begins shutting down. Most people never notice the transformation until it's too late. Because empaths don't always react loudly when they're breaking internally. Sometimes they become more patient, more forgiving, more emotionally available. And that's exactly why their pain goes unnoticed for so long. But here's the disturbing truth. Repeated emotional pain doesn't just hurt an empath emotionally. It rewires them psychologically. It changes the way they trust, connect, love, and even see themselves. And there's one internal shift that happens near the end, a shift so dangerous that once it fully forms, the empath may never become the same person again. And when you understand what that shift is, you'll understand why some of the softest people eventually become emotionally unreachable. An empath usually enters relationships differently than most people. They don't just hear your words. They study your tone, your energy, your silences. They notice when your smile looks forced. They can sense emotional tension before a single argument even begins. And because they feel everything so deeply, they naturally become emotional caretakers. They comfort people, defend people, excuse people, or pie, even when those same people slowly become the source of their pain. That's the paradox of empathy. The more emotionally aware someone becomes, the more pain they often tolerate before walking away. Because empaths don't give up easily. They constantly search for reasons behind behavior. If someone becomes cold, the empath assumes they're hurting internally. If someone becomes distant, they try loving harder. If someone lashes out emotionally, the empath starts analyzing the hidden pain beneath the anger instead of protecting themselves from it. And that's where the damage begins. Repeated emotional hurt doesn't break an empath all at once. It happens through accumulation, a dismissed feeling here, an ignored message there, a sarcastic comment disguised as a joke, broken promises, emotional inconsistency, lack of reassurance, feeling emotionally unseen while constantly seeing everyone else. Each experience seems small individually, but emotionally, the empath absorbs everything, or the one. And over time, their nervous system starts living in a constant state of emotional alertness. This is where psychology becomes important. When a person experiences repeated emotional disappointment, especially from someone they deeply care about, the brain begins anticipating pain before it even happens. The empath starts overanalyzing conversations, facial expressions, delays in texting, tone changes, emotional distance. Not because they're dramatic, because their mind has been trained through repeated hurt to search for emotional danger. And eventually, hyper-awareness becomes hypervigilance. That's exhausting. Imagine constantly monitoring someone's mood just to emotionally prepare yourself for disappointment. Imagine walking into conversations already anxious about feeling dismissed. Imagine loving someone deeply while simultaneously fearing the emotional pain they might cause next. That internal conflict slowly destroys emotional peace. But here's what makes the pain unique. Most empaths hide it exceptionally well. They continue showing up for people, continue listening, continue comforting others, while privately feeling emotionally abandoned themselves. That's why people often misunderstand empaths completely. They assume the empath is strong because they rarely explode emotionally. But many empaths don't express pain immediately because they process it internally first. And internalized pain is dangerous, because what isn't released emotionally gets stored psychologically. The empath starts suppressing emotions to avoid conflict. They stop mentioning what hurts them because they're tired of feeling too sensitive. They minimize their own emotional needs just to keep the relationship stable. But emotional suppression always has consequences. At first, it creates anxiety, then emotional exhaustion, then emotional numbness. And emotional numbness is where everything changes, because once an empath becomes emotionally numb, stop connecting the way they used to. The warmth fades, the excitement fades, the emotional openness fades. Not because they want to become cold, but because their nervous system is trying to survive. Repeated hurt teaches the empath a painful lesson. Being emotionally open is dangerous, and once the brain associates vulnerability with pain, trust becomes extremely difficult. This creates one of the most heartbreaking transformations imaginable. The same empath who once loved deeply and openly now starts holding parts of themselves back. They think twice before expressing emotions. They hesitate before trusting compliments. They become cautious with attachment. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring became emotionally expensive. That's what repeated hurt does internally. It turns emotional safety into emotional risk. There's another hidden effect people rarely talk about. Repeated emotional pain changes how empaths see themselves. At first they question the relationship, but eventually they start questioning themselves. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I'm hard to love. That self-doubt is psychologically destructive, because empaths naturally personalize emotional disconnection. They don't immediately assume others are emotionally unavailable. Instead, they wonder what they themselves did wrong. And when someone repeatedly hurts them while offering occasional affection in between, the empath becomes trapped in confusion. One day they feel valued. The next day they feel invisible. That emotional inconsistency creates psychological dependency. Why? Because unpredictable affection activates powerful reward systems in the brain. The empath starts emotionally clinging to moments of warmth while tolerating long periods of emotional pain just to experience those moments again. It becomes emotionally addictive. That's why many empaths stay in painful relationships longer than they should. They're not weak, they're emotionally attached to potential. They keep remembering who the person was in the beginning. They keep hoping consistency will return. But repeated disappointment slowly changes something internally. The empath begins grieving while still in the relationship. And this is the stage most people completely miss. The empath still texts, still shows up, still smiles. But internally, they've started emotionally mourning the connection. Every ignored emotion creates distance. Every broken promise weakens attachment. Every moment of feeling emotionally unsafe pushes them further inward, until eventually, the relationship feels emotionally lonely even when both people are still physically present. That loneliness is devastating for empaths, because empaths crave emotional depth more than surface-level connection. They want honesty, presence, emotional reciprocity. They want to feel emotionally chosen, not emotionally tolerated. And when they repeatedly feel emotionally alone, or beside someone they love, the pain becomes unbearable. But instead of exploding outwardly, many empaths collapse inwardly. They become quieter, more detached, less expressive, not because they stopped feeling, but because they started protecting what little emotional energy they had left. This is where people make a fatal mistake. They interpret the empath's silence as emotional stability. In reality, silence is often the final stage before emotional withdrawal, because when empaths stop trying to explain their pain, it usually means they no longer believe they'll be understood. And once hope disappears, emotional detachment begins. Detachment doesn't happen suddenly. It happens through repeated emotional disappointment. Every time the empath feels dismissed, a piece of trust disappears. Every time they feel emotionally neglected, a piece of connection weakens. Every time they feel emotionally unsafe, a piece of vulnerability closes, until eventually, there's almost nothing, or pie, left emotionally open. That transformation terrifies people when they finally notice it, because the empath who once cared so deeply suddenly feels distant, unavailable, hard to reach emotionally. But what people fail to realize is that version of the empath didn't appear randomly. It was created through repeated emotional pain that went unresolved for too long. There's also something psychologically brutal about empath suffering. They often continue understanding the people who hurt them. Even after being mistreated, they still recognize the other person's trauma, stress, fears, insecurities. They still empathize with the pain behind the behavior. And that empathy becomes self-destructive when boundaries are missing, because understanding someone's pain is not the same as surviving their emotional damage. That realization changes empaths permanently. Eventually, they understand something heartbreaking. You can deeply understand someone and still realize they are unhealthy, or for your emotional well-being. That's an incredibly painful truth for empathetic people because they naturally want to heal relationships instead of leaving them. But repeated hurt forces a psychological evolution. The empath slowly stops prioritizing emotional rescue over emotional survival. And once that shift happens internally, the relationship dynamic changes forever. Now they begin observing instead of chasing, protecting instead of overgiving, distancing instead of over-explaining. And this new version of the empath often gets called cold by the very people who emotionally exhausted them. But they're not cold, they're emotionally injured. There's a difference. One of the darkest things repeated hurt does to an empath is it makes them feel emotionally unsafe in places that once felt comforting. Conversations that once brought excitement now create anxiety. Phone notifications trigger stress instead of happiness. Emotional closeness starts feeling dangerous instead of beautiful. That's trauma conditioning. The nervous system remembers emotional pain even when the heart wants to forget it. And because empaths feel things intensely, emotional wounds often stay in their system longer than people realize. That's why some empaths suddenly isolate themselves after repeated hurt. They become more private, more selective, less trusting. Not because they hate people, but because their mind associates emotional closeness with emotional exhaustion. The saddest part? Most people only notice this transformation after the empath has emotionally disappeared. They say things like, "You changed, you're distant now, you don't care anymore," without realizing they witnessed the slow destruction of someone who spent months or years trying to stay emotionally connected despite constantly hurting internally. And here's the painful truth many people avoid. Repeated emotional pain eventually kills emotional innocence. The empath who once believed everyone had good intentions becomes more cautious. The empath who once trusted easily becomes guarded. The empath who once gave endless chances starts walking away faster. Pain teaches pattern recognition, and empaths learn patterns deeply. They remember emotional inconsistencies, broken trust, moments they felt emotionally abandoned. Even if they never mention those memories aloud, their nervous system remembers them. That's why repeated hurt changes behavior permanently. The empath's body starts protecting them automatically. Less vulnerability, less emotional risk, less attachment. And while this protection helps survival, it also creates sadness internally. Because many empaths don't want to become guarded. They miss the version of themselves that loved freely, but experience changed them. Repeated pain forced emotional armor onto a heart that originally wanted connection, not defense. That internal conflict is exhausting. Part of the empath still wants closeness. Another part appears being hurt again. So they live in emotional contradiction, wanting connection while fearing attachment, wanting honesty while expecting disappointment, wanting love while protecting themselves from it simultaneously. That's what repeated hurt does psychologically. It fractures trust from the inside out. And unfortunately, some people unknowingly deepen this damage by invalidating empath emotions instead of understanding them. Stop overthinking. You're too sensitive. It's not that serious. Those phrases may seem small. But to an empath already drowning internally, they create emotional isolation. Because now the empath not only feels hurt, they feel misunderstood for being hurt. And misunderstood pain becomes loneliness. Extreme loneliness, especially when surrounded by people physically but emotionally disconnected. This is why emotional validation matters so deeply to empaths. They don't expect perfection, they just want emotional acknowledgement, to feel heard or seen. Safe enough to express emotions without being shamed for them. But repeated invalidation teaches them silence, and silence slowly changes personality. The empath becomes less expressive, less spontaneous, less emotionally open, until eventually, even they barely recognize themselves anymore. That's the frightening part about repeated emotional hurt. It doesn't just damage relationships, it changes identity. The empath starts abandoning parts of themselves just to survive emotionally. They become less trusting because trust became painful, less vulnerable because vulnerability became dangerous, less hopeful because hope repeatedly led to disappointment. And after enough emotional pain, survival instincts replace emotional openness. This is often the moment when people suddenly think the empath stopped caring. But internally, something much deeper happened. The empath became emotionally exhausted beyond repair. Emotional exhaustion is different from temporary sadness, or sadness still hopes. Exhaustion stops expecting. That's why emotionally exhausted empaths often detach quietly instead of dramatically. No screaming. No revenge, no chaos, just distance. And that silence confuses people because it feels emotionally final. That's because it usually is. By the time an empath reaches emotional detachment, they've already replayed every memory, every conversation, every disappointment in their mind countless times. They didn't leave impulsively. They emotionally processed the pain long before physically withdrawing. And once emotional peace begins feeling safer than emotional connection, it becomes incredibly difficult to pull them back. People underestimate how much emotional stress-sensitive individuals absorb daily. Empaths don't just carry their own emotions. They absorb tension from environments, relationships, conversations, even unspoken energy. So when someone repeatedly becomes the source of emotional instability in their life, the empath, the nervous system eventually starts rejecting that connection entirely. Not out of cruelty, out of self-preservation. This is the hidden reason some empaths suddenly disappear without explanation. They reached a psychological threshold where staying emotionally connected became more painful than leaving. And the body always chooses survival eventually, even if the heart takes longer to accept it. One of the most tragic aspects of repeated hurt is that many empaths continue loving people who are emotionally destroying them. They see the potential, the good moments, the wounded inner child beneath toxic behavior. But empathy cannot heal someone unwilling to take responsibility for the pain they cause. And eventually, the empath realizes they've spent so much time understanding others that nobody stopped to truly understand them. That realization cuts deeply, because empaths often feel emotionally invisible in relationships where they give the most. Everyone comes to them for support, advice, comfort, healing. But very few ask the empath, how are you really doing emotionally? And after repeated hurt, that emotional neglect accumulates into resentment, sadness, and eventually detachment. This is where many empaths experience a psychological awakening. They finally understand that being needed is not the same as being loved. That realization changes everything, because some people become attached to the emotional benefits empaths provide, not the empath themselves. They love the comfort, the validation, the emotional safety, but fail to protect the empath emotionally in return. And once the empath sees this imbalance clearly, the connection begins collapsing internally, not immediately, but permanently. There's also a neurological side to repeated emotional hurt people rarely discuss. Chronic emotional stress keeps the nervous system activated for long periods. The empath begins living in anticipation rather than peace, constant overthinking, company, constante emotional monitoring, constant anxiety. Over time, this drains mental clarity, emotional energy, and even physical health. That's why many empaths feel physically exhausted in emotionally unhealthy relationships. Their body is carrying invisible psychological tension every day, and eventually, the body starts begging for peace. That's why healing often feels strange to empaths after painful experiences. At first, calmness feels unfamiliar. Safe people feel boring. Stability feels suspicious, because their nervous system adapted to emotional unpredictability. But once they finally experience emotionally healthy connection, something incredible happens. They realize love was never supposed to feel like survival. It was supposed to feel safe. That realization can be both beautiful and heartbreaking. Beautiful because they finally understand healthy emotional connection. Heartbreaking because they realize how much pain they normalized for years. And after that realization, many empaths become extremely selective with who they allow into their emotional world. Not out of bitterness, out of wisdom. They begin protecting their peace the way they once protected everyone else's emotions. And honestly, they earned that right through suffering. Repeated hurt forces empaths to mature emotionally in painful ways. They stop believing words without actions, stop confusing inconsistency with passion, stop romanticizing emotional chaos. Because chaos exhausted them, now they crave honesty, stability, gentleness, emotional accountability. Things that once seemed boring now feel emotionally safe. And emotional safety becomes priceless after psychological exhaustion. One of the final internal changes repeated hurt creates in an empath is emotional independence. At first they relied heavily on emotional connection for meaning, but after enough disappointment, they learned to emotionally survive alone. That survival instinct makes them stronger, but also harsh, the to reach. Because once someone learns how to survive emotional loneliness alone, they become far less willing to tolerate unhealthy relationships just to avoid being alone. That's why many empaths eventually choose solitude over emotionally draining connections, not because they stopped loving people, because they finally learn to love themselves enough to stop accepting emotional harm. And that lesson usually comes after years of silent suffering. The truth is, repeated hurt transforms empaths in ways most people never fully understand. It changes how they trust, how they communicate, how deeply they allow themselves to feel. Some become wiser, some become guarded, some become quieter. But almost all of them carry invisible emotional scars from loving too deeply in places that never felt emotionally safe. And maybe that's the hardest part about being an empath. Feeling everything intensely in a world where many people barely notice emotional damage until it's too late. But there's also strength in this transformation. Because once empaths heal, they stop abandoning themselves for connection. They begin recognizing red flags earlier. They stop shrinking their emotions to make others comfortable. They realize their sensitivity was never weakness. It was awareness. And awareness changes everything. Now they notice emotional inconsistency immediately. Notice manipulation faster. Notice when effort stops matching words. And because of that awareness, they begin protecting their emotional energy differently. Not everyone gets unlimited access anymore. Not everyone deserves their softness anymore. And honestly, that boundary is healthy, because empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. The deepest irony is that many empaths spend years trying to save others emotionally, while nobody notices they're slowly drowning themselves. Until one day they finally stop. They stop over-explaining, stop chasing, stop over-giving, and in that silence, they begin rebuilding themselves, slowly, painfully, but honestly. The healed empath becomes someone entirely different from the wounded empath. They still care deeply, but now they care with discernment. They still love deeply, but no longer at the cost of their mental peace. And perhaps that's the real transformation repeated hurt creates internally. It teaches empaths that love without emotional safety eventually becomes emotional suffering, and no human being can survive emotional suffering forever without changing. So if you know someone who feels deeply, someone who constantly supports others emotionally, someone who always seems understanding, patient, and emotionally available, don't assume they're invincible emotionally. Sensitive people often hide the deepest pain behind the calmest behavior, and repeated hurt leaves marks no one can see immediately. Sometimes the kindest people are carrying the heaviest emotional weight in silence. So the next time someone or rash, Neurable trusts you with their emotions, pay attention to how you handle their heart. Because empaths rarely break loudly. They break internally. And once too much inside them changes, they may never become the same person again. So tell me honestly, do you think repeated emotional pain makes empaths stronger in the end, or does it slowly destroy parts of them that never fully come back?